Since Aaron, you are the host, maybe you want to introduce the Chhavi and start the talk.
Sure. And actually, I didn't catch everyone's intro, so maybe before we start the talk, we could just do another full round. Everyone could just introduce themselves one more time. No, just kidding.
I can go first.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to these talks. Our first speaker is Chhavi Yadav. She works on trustworthy machine learning at UCSD, and I think the work she is going to speak about won the Best Paper Award at the iClear Privacy Workshop. Is that right? So looking forward to hearing about it.
Thank you for the intro, Aaron, and I think I can get started. So let me share my screen. Yeah, so what do you see? Do you see my speaker notes screen or do you...
We see the speaker notes screen, so you want to share the other one?
Oh. Yeah, now do you see?
It's good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the paper is titled Fair Proof, and this is joint work with Amrita, Dan, and Kamalika. So yeah, I just start this talk with the disclaimer that I'm not a cryptographer, so I'm sorry in advance if I can't answer some of your cryptography-related questions. Yes, so ML models, as we all know, are being used in a couple of high-stake applications these days, like in financial institutions, in healthcare, autonomous driving, and so on. But at the same time, every day we find a new headline about how broken these systems are, and this demonstrates a public concern about whether these models have any good properties at all. So for responsible deployment, we need technology that enables verification of properties of the models by the public, right? Since there is a distrust, we would want technology that enables verification of some good properties like fairness, robustness, etc. And we want the public to be able to verify these properties. So the real world constraint that occurs here is confidentiality. For example, suppose a bank is using an ML model for loan approval decisions. So it will likely keep its model confidential due to IP reasons. But then still, the customers on the other hand are being affected by the decisions given by this model. So they should be able to verify some goodness properties of the model. Yeah, so that brings us to the main question of the talk, which is how to publicly verify properties of a model while keeping the model confidential. So some of you might know about this problem, and the canonical approach to solving it is through external auditing. So you have a third-party auditor which does API queries with the hidden model and tries to estimate some properties of the hidden model through answers to these API queries. And the queries can either come from a fixed reference data set or they can be created adaptively. So there has been some work in the literature which shows that most of the times you can leak the model, the confidential model, in the process of these API queries. And so it defeats the purpose of confidentiality. So there are concerns if black box auditing is even possible. The second concern that occurs is, like, what if the model is swapped post-auditing and then the audit decisions, they don't hold anymore? Right? So that's a big problem in case like auditing is not done periodically and stuff like that. Yeah, and the third problem comes with the choice of a reference auditing dataset. So if you audit using reference auditing datasets, which usually is the case, then your answers rely on the auditing dataset, right? Your auditing decisions rely on the auditing dataset. So our solution to public verification with confidentiality will use zero-knowledge proofs, a cryptographic primitive, and I will talk more about this later, but this is the gist of the paper, essentially. Yes, so about the problem setting. basically we have a bank on one side, which uses a machine learning model to make a loan prediction, a loan approval prediction. And then we have a customer on the other end. So this customer applies for a loan application, and then the bank returns a decision, whether approved or not. And it also gives a fairness score or a fairness certificate, which says that how fair it was while making this decision. And along with the certificate, we also give a zero knowledge proof of the certificate. So these three things are returned by the bank, and we want some guarantees to hold in this setting. So the first one is that the same model is used for all customers. So the bank doesn't swap or like give arbitrary decisions. So it's using a fixed model. And the second condition guarantee that we want should hold is that the model stays confidential. The customer still doesn't know anything about the model. And the third guarantee that we want should hold is that the returned fairness certificate is in fact correct. And the zero knowledge proof helps us prove that. So these are the three guarantees that we would want from this setting.
All right, I guess I should have asked, do you prefer if we hold all questions until the end, or do you want us to like interject with questions as they arise?
I think you can ask questions as they come. That would be better.
So what does it mean that it's the same model for all customers? Like, unless you restrict the model class.
Yes, so this comes from some adversarial work that I have seen in the literature. So what happens is people just swap the model for some minority class or for some group of people. So the predictions can come from basically another model for different people.
But like in principle, I could just call that one model, right? Like a model is just a mapping of people to predictions. So like, how are you different? Why are you saying that is not one model that happens to make decisions based on group indicator functions or something?
Right. So you're saying like there could be an if-else clause and you use different models, and it's basically one model or a selector basically, right? So that could be, but then the underlying problem here is that the other models could be sort of unfair, like they're not meant to make good predictions for a certain group of people, right? And this information is not publicly disclosed. So if you have that selector model and if you disclose it publicly, like I will talk later in the model in the paper, then it's fine.
Okay, so it's like when you say the same model for all customers, it's like some kind of constraint on consistency with what I disclosed about my model publicly.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Also, I guess I should have also said this at the beginning, but these talks are like half an hour long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and I hope that clarified some of the doubts that people had. So our solution in this setting is basically fair proof. It has two steps. So one is, how do you calculate fairness score in the clear? And then how do you verify this fairness score using zero knowledge proofs? So we will start with the first one. Right. So the first question is, what is the fairness metric that you're going to use? So we are going to use local individual fairness. And it's usually defined like this. I'm sorry, I'm missing a citation. So given a model F and a data point D star, we use some distance metrics to find an epsilon where the predictions are same. So the epsilon is a radius of a region where the predictions are the same. So our certification algorithm should output this epsilon. So that will tell us how fair we are around a point. And here fair means like basically stability.
How come this doesn't mean all predictions are the same?
All predictions are the same?
Well, can't I like walk between any 2 points in a metric space by taking steps of less than epsilon?
Right, so we consider the largest epsilon, right? The largest epsilon where the predictions are the same in a region.
But oh, this is with respect to a single point.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And so here we have the notion of a sensitive attribute. So maybe race or gender, like because this is about fairness. So there is some sensitive attribute that we care about. And then the distance metric that we will use in our paper is weighted L2 distance with 0 weights on the sensitive attributes. So if there's 0 weights on the sensitive attributes, then like given that all the other features are the same, just gender is different, for example, or race is different, then all these points are the same. So these are the assumptions. We use weighted L2 distance with weights of 0 on the sensitive attributes. We will use ReLU activated fully connected neural networks for the rest of the paper. And we also will focus on discrete sensitive features. So yeah, so how do we design a fairness certification algorithm? So the key here is that it should be ZKP amenable, because on these zero knowledge proof libraries, they are very computationally heavy. So whatever algorithm you design in the clear should be able, like we should be able to transfer it in the ZKP domain. So we will use 3 key ideas to help us create an algorithm which is ZKP amenable. So the first one is that local individual fairness is closely connected to adversarial robustness. And there's a lot of work on how to certify adversarial robustness. So we plan to use some of that for this purpose. So just to talk a little bit about the connection. So the definition of adversarial robustness is very similar to that of individual fairness. So here we have a norm, maybe L2 norm, and if the distance between the point, if there's a radius of epsilon around a point, then like all the points in this ball should have the same prediction. And this is very similar to the local individual fairness definition that I talked about earlier. Just the difference is that here we are considering L2 weighted L2 norm, and basically there's a notion of a sensitive attribute, which doesn't really exist in adversarial robustness. So just in red, I'm just trying to demonstrate the connection here. So in red, we have the decision boundary, and just ignore the dashed lines. So given a point X star, and like in 2-dimension space, where suppose one feature is sensitive and the other is non-sensitive. So given this point X star, adversarial robustness would give us this radius, because this is a decision boundary. So this would be the radius. This is the largest. And then when you talk about fairness, so given this point X star, if you change the sensitive attribute like to A or C, then all these points are the same, right? This point is equivalent to this point and this point. So our algorithm just runs the adversarial robustness algorithm 3 times, and then it picks the minimum epsilon. Because like this point is equivalent to this point and this point. So you can find the robustness radius 3 times, and then you pick the minimum. So it's basically fairness is robustness in n-1 dimensions. Yeah, if anybody has questions, please go ahead. I don't think I did a good job explaining this, but I hope it's clear.
So let me ask a question about the metric. So the metric you're thinking about is just sort of flipping sensitive attribute. Like one thing that sort of is confusing to me is that quite often the sensitive attributes will not, like explicitly be inputs to the model, like in a credit model. Like you don't actually take like race as input, for example. That would be illegal. So like how should I think about the metric? Like is it important that the metric is defined on sensitive attributes, or could it be defined on other features as well?
Right. So for this paper, we assume that there has to be the sensitive attribute has to be the input. So one thing that I have read in the fairness literature is that there are a lot of features which are correlated to the sensitive attribute in some sense. But even if even those are removed, then this thing doesn't work, basically.
Yeah, so there's lots of correlates. So like should I think of the metric as being defined on those. Like, I guess I haven't grokked the, and maybe you're going to get to this, but I haven't grokked like the importance of the metric being defined on the sensitive attributes as opposed to like the other attributes.
This is just something that I found in the literature, which is popularly used, like just using an L2 distance with 0 weights on the sensitive attributes. So even if, suppose you feed the input, feed the sensitive features, right? Still the fairness, in the fairness definition, the weights are 0, right? So they are nulled out.
I see. But is for the results you're going to talk about, is the only important thing that you're using some weighted L2 metric?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so this is the connection. So basically, this connection allows us to use a robustness certification algorithm to certify fairness. And I'm talking about specifically local individual fairness. The second idea is to use an efficient robustness certification algorithm, because there exist many people have done a lot of work on this. So we pick one, which we found that we could actually code in ZKP libraries efficiently. So this is GeoCert, and I can tell you more details about it if you want later. I have slides on that. And the third key idea that we use is we define, like our algorithm, our ZKP, our algorithm gives a lower bound to the true epsilon, right? So if you want to find the true epsilon, then you have to solve some convex optimization problem using some solvers, which will be hard to code in ZKP libraries. So we will give a lower bound, which we can efficiently code for because there's a closed form. And this means that the true model can only be more fair, right? Because we're giving a lower bound. So the true model can only be more fair than what's certified by us. Yeah, and this is the final algorithm. So let's suppose given point X star, the neural network F, the distance function D, and if you have K-sensitive features and we're assuming that all of them are discrete, then you have to run this algorithm these many times, basically the domain of multiplication of the domain of all of these, right? So you find an epsilon for each of these X stars, which is changed based on the sensitive feature, and then you return the minimum. Yeah, so one question is, can our resulting certification algorithm distinguish between more versus less fair models? So if the radius epsilon is higher, then we think that the model is more fair because the model is stable and it's less susceptible to small changes. So similar people get similar predictions. And the reverse for a smaller epsilon. So yeah, so here we have two models. One is fair and the other is unfair. So we see that for the fair model, this is like this is a histogram over 100 randomly sampled data points. So we see that the fairness of the fair model from this is returned from our algorithm, right? So here the fairness is higher than that what we see for unfair model, the distribution that we see for unfair model.
Sorry, can you explain what is happening in this histogram?
Yes, so basically we have a fair model and an unfair model. We run our algorithm, certification algorithm on those models for 100 randomly sampled points. And then we plot a histogram of the epsilons that are returned from our algorithm for those points. So for unfair model, we expect the epsilons to be lower. For fair models, we expect the epsilons to be higher. So here, this is just a distribution, right? So we see that the support is from like 7.5 to 13, but here for the unfair model is 0 to 3.
Oh, I see. So in the first plot, you're saying that most of the mass is concentrated in like larger ranges of epsilon. That's the point, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so if that's okay, then hopefully I've established how to calculate fairness score in the clear. And then now next, we will move to how do you verify this fairness certificate using zero knowledge proofs? Yeah, so just to give you a 101 about zero knowledge proofs, in this setting, we have a prover and a verifier, both of whom have access to circuit P. And the prover has a private input W, which in our case are going to be the model weights, such that circuit of W is equal to 1. Right? And then the goal of the prover is to convince the verifier that this P of W equal to 1 is P of W is equal to 1 without revealing any additional information about W. And ZKPs have some good properties that come from the way they are designed in cryptography. So like some soundness, completeness, and zero leakage properties. So if there's an honest prover, then it can convince the verifier that the property does indeed hold. And if the prover is malicious, then it cannot convince the verifier that the property holds. So these are those soundness and completeness properties. And then the last one is, if there's a malicious verifier who wants to learn more about W, then it cannot do so. And these just come from the way the ZKPs are designed. So now just translating what we want in the fairness certificate, like what is our P of W equal to 1? So what we want to prove is that the local individual fairness at X star is at least epsilon, right? This is the statement. And our W is the model weights. Right, so how do you verify fairness scores with ZKP? So the first idea is to convert our certification algorithm just as it is into a ZKP circuit. But like even with what we have, like the ZKP amenable GeoCert for loop thing that I talked about, even with that is too challenging to code in a ZKP library. And this comes because of 2-3 challenges. One of the major one being that only arithmetic operations are allowed in these libraries. So you can't do for loops, you can't do some complicated things. You have to boil down everything to basic arithmetic. So if we just coded our algorithm directly, then it would result in a very large circuit and a very high computation time and a very high overhead. So one idea that we use is that verification should take less time than rerunning the algorithm in many cases. For example, if we want to prove that 6 is not a prime, then given the factors 3 and 2, verifier only needs to check if 3 multiplied by 2 equals 6. So we use a lot of these tricks in coding the algorithm into ZKP. So one of them is like strategically verify some parts of the certification algorithm, which mean that the entire certification algorithm is verified, and we reuse these parts again and again, just like a function. And the second key idea that we have is we do some offline computations, which help us reduce the computational overhead. Right, so the strategy here is initially the bank will publish a commitment to the model weights. So it's a cryptographic public commitment. So if the bank uses some other model than it disclosed, then it will be caught, like the proof won't go through. So the initial step, which is done offline, is to publish a commitment to the model weights. And there's a lot of research in cryptography or in ZKP for ML, which talks about like how to do this commitment. So we don't focus much on this in the paper. And in the online phase, as each customer comes in, we give the certificate. Basically, we give the ZKP for the certificate and we run our algorithm. Varun, do you have a question? Okay, maybe not. Yeah, so these were the guarantees that we wanted to hold. So we want the same model for all customers. That just comes from the commitment, model commitment, and the model stays confidential. This comes from the zero knowledge property, right? And fairness score should be calculated. Right, so the fairness score is indeed the fairness score that was calculated. It's not some made up number. So that comes from the ZKP proof. Yeah, so I've talked a lot about how computationally heavy ZKPs are. So with all our tricks, we see that the computation is not too costly. So there are two parts to the ZKP library code. So basically there's proof generation and then there's verification. So proof generation is done on the bank's end, and then the verification is done on the customer end. So we want the verification to be very light, right? Because customer doesn't have many resources and all of that. And the proof generation and ZKPs are designed like such that the verification time is very less as compared to proof generation. And even in proof generation, we have two phases. One is online and the other is offline proof generation. So we see that this is the plot of time in averaged over 100 random samples. So we see that max, it takes like 4 minutes for online proof generation and 1.5 minutes for offline proof generation. So on the x-axis, we have different data sets and different models. And the verification time is on the order of seconds. So here we see like max 3.5 seconds.
So how many sensitive features here are we considering?
Oh, I
Yes.
see. I forget exactly, but I think it was just one in each.
One in each.
Yeah.
And so and you were saying that with the number of sensitive features, like the running time really becomes high, right?
Yeah, so it will just be multiplied with the number of features and their domain.
I see. Okay. So if there are multiple sensitive features, then we will see the curves will not be that good. Or like, what is the plan? Like, is the plan that you consider each sensitive feature and
Right. So one thing we could easily quickly do is just parallelize this thing, right? Because each epsilon is calculated individually, so separately from each other's. And here we don't use any parallelization. It's just not even multi-threading. It's just a simple CPU job. So you can parallelize it, and that will save a lot of cost.
And is there any sense of like that we would need that this n to the k, whatever you were showing for k sensitive features, is it known like we cannot do better than that or?
No, I don't think so. Like theoretically, I don't.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
So the second dimension where we want to check the computational overhead is in terms of the proof size. So we want the proof to be light. We don't want it to be too heavy. So here we see that it's 200 kilobytes max. So that's pretty light. Yes, so in summary, we provide an algorithm to verify local individual fairness of models with ZKP. And this is a full stack solution. It works for confidential models and it has a manageable compute overhead. So some future directions can be scalability to large language models or some bigger models. Of course, that will need a lot of smart solutions. You can't do that with just some simple things. And one idea could be maybe you can do some stuff on the final layers or the MLP layers. The good thing is there's still MLP, so maybe you can do something about that. And another direction that I can think of is where else can we use ZKPs? What other properties a user might want to verify? Yeah, like Barna said, maybe some theoretical stuff could also be done. Any questions?
Applause. Everyone should turn on their cameras and make applause
Yeah.
animations and applause noises into your microphone.
Yay.
Woo!
Yay.
And I think we have time for a few questions before Natalie's talk. Does anyone have any questions? I have a question if nobody has any questions. So cool. So a lot of the, I guess, machinery here relies on you defining fairness as like the margin around a point, like the distance to the decision boundary, which is like not usually how people think about individual fairness. Like typically individual fairness would sort of say, okay, well, like I'm allowed to treat different points differently. It's just that how differently I treat them should depend on some way and how similar they are. So usually it's like a Lipschitz constraint on a model. And in a binary classification setting, it would sort of say something like, okay, the probability that I classify, Bob differently than Alice should depend in some way in proportion to the distance between Alice and Bob in the metric space. So like, do any of these techniques generalize to that setting, or are they really specific to calling, like to sort of saying, okay, well, we're going to call the margin like fairness?
So one thing is that like we look at all this from the lens of, can we code this in a ZKP library, right? So as long as you can code this in a ZKP library, of course you have to make changes to the algorithm, but as long as you can code it in the ZKP library, I think this framework should work.
What is the thing you would need to code?
So we need to code our certification algorithm, right? So what is the certification algorithm that you would use in the clear? So based on your definition, maybe we have to sample some points, or like, I don't know what's the certification algorithm in that case, but like you have to design something that is ZKP amenable.
Right, okay. Any other questions? I think you can just unmute and go for it.
So to start with, the weights of this network is going to be committed, and we always claim that the same network is being used to respond to every question. So doesn't it make sense to simply prove in the public in the beginning itself that whatever network has been committed to is fair on the whole globally? And then you don't need to give the proofs later. You just need to prove that you're using consistent network every time to respond.
Yeah, so one thing could be like, I'm just thinking about it in terms of a user. Like does the user want global fairness, or does the user want like fairness around its point, right? So Aaron probably would know more, but like I think in those two situations, the fairness properties will give very different answers, right?
Well, I think for the definition you've used, if you asked for this to hold for non-zero epsilon for every point, the classifier would have to be a constant. So it only makes sense in this local setting, right?
Yes. I mean, you could use like some demographic parity metrics, but then for the user, maybe that doesn't matter much.
Right, so like usually when people talk about individual fairness, it's a global property, and it says there's like a metric space, and for any 2 points on the metric space, the probability that they get a positive classification should differ in proportion to that distance. That's a global property that I don't know about how you'd verify it, but like in principle you could verify that, like, that's a property of the network. Whereas if I understood correctly, what we're talking about here only makes sense as a property around an individual point.
Yes, that's true.
I have a quick just clarification question. At some point in the slide, you mentioned that n-dimensional fairness is equivalent to n-1 dimensional adversarial robustness.
Yeah, the one, I just assuming that there's only one set.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so that was your question.
All right, I guess everyone can make applause noises. So.
Yeah, so I just wanted to put out that there's some other things that I do, like unlearning in LLMs, data attributions, and some explainability. So if people want to work on this together, we can always chat. You can email me, and I'm also looking for some postdoc positions starting next year. So if there's any suitable fit, please let me know.
Yeah, so spread the word about yeah, so Chhavi will be in the job market next year for postdoc positions. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so then shall we move to the next talk? So, Sanjay, like I will let you introduce Natalie and take over.
Okay, so Natalie Collina is a PhD student at UPenn, working with Aaron Roth and Michael Kearns. I got an introduction to Natalie's work last week. I was at a workshop where John Schneider at Google was talking about work that he had done with Natalie on Pareto optimal learning in games. Really cool stuff. And so it'll be exciting to hear about her latest results.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm glad you got to see that presentation. I really like that paper. Okay, so I guess I will share my screen. Is that the way we're doing this? Okay, wonderful. Sorry, I should have like had it all up and ready to go. But I'm so sorry. Just let me figure out
And
where my things are. Mhm. Hope everyone
And
had a
Natalie,
nice
is it
weekend.
okay? Is it okay if people interrupt you with questions during the talk?
Absolutely. I would much rather not get through everything than like have people be confused.
Okay.
Oh, this is me having way too many tabs. Okay, here we go. I found it. Okay, I will now share my screen. Okay. Okay. I've started sharing from here. Let me share from the beginning. That might be a nice thing to do. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, cool. I'm Natalie Collina, and I'm really excited to talk today about some joint work with Sir Bikol, Varun Gupta, and Aaron Roth on tractable agreement protocols via calibration. So our motivation is that humans use AI to help them make decisions. And so let's look at a motivating example of a medical expert who would like to make medical decisions and has to help them some sort of powerful machine learning system. And some patient enters. And this patient, there might be different features that can be perceived by the model and by the human, right? So there might be some things that both the human and the model are able to kind of internalize, help them make care decisions, right? Maybe things like their blood type, their past diagnoses. But there also might be things that are really easier to one or either of them to better digest, right? So this big model it'll have these weights, right? Which might not be immediately clear, like what they even mean to the human, but can help maybe identify really complex patterns and large amounts of data to help make decisions. And on the other hand, you have this medical expert who can actually see the patient, and they also might have some other expertise and things they can learn from this patient that might not be captured in the model. Okay, so say that this situation happens, right? And the human here asks the model, okay, what do you think? So there's some operation I want to do, and I would like to know what the risk of this operation is. And the model says, well, I think there's a 20% chance it'll go really badly. Okay, and it's entirely possible, right, that the human, based on their own set of information they can gain from this patient in their own internal model of their brain, disagrees. So what do we do in this sort of situation, right? This is not a nice situation because now this human either has to decide to just completely ignore the expertise of this model, or they can do something that they don't think is right. So we want to come up with a framework to make it so that you can turn this bad situation into one where actually the human is able to leverage the power of the model in a way that increases their own accuracy, but also in a way that they can trust, in a way that leads to agreement. So let's talk a bit about agreement. So there's this really nice line of work starting with Oman's agreement theorem, which basically says if you have two Bayesian agents, right? So we'll talk a bit more about what this means, but basically, if there's a true prior on the world, right? Say it's risk of this surgery going badly, and they have a correctly specified prior on it, and they will fully update their posteriors according to information they learn, right? So quite a strong behavioral assumption. But they have common knowledge, right? They both know what the other person knows. I know X, I know X, I know X ad infinitum. then actually they know the same thing. So they can't agree to disagree, right? So if really what were happening was this human and this model knew exactly what the other person, they had common knowledge, then they actually would have the same agreement. But of course, this is not, doesn't say anything about dynamics at all, right? Because it's not really true that we have common knowledge. So some later follow-up work says, actually, if instead of truly having common knowledge, they just pass back and forth their expectation on this thing they're trying to predict, based on their current knowledge, their current posterior, based on the information they've seen so far, right? So if I say, my expectation is this, and then the next person says, well, given that I see that you said that, and given what I know about the prior, I think it's this, then it actually takes only a finite number of rounds of communication before they have the same expectation over this object. But this still says nothing about how long it's going to take, just that it's finite. So most similarly to what we're going to discuss, Scott Aronson in 2004 had a paper that said, okay, if these predictions that you're predicting are in fact one-dimensional, and you have two Bayesian agents, then they could reach epsilon delta disagreement in only 1/epsilon² delta rounds. And what is epsilon delta agreement? It means that with probability 1 minus delta over the draw of the true state from the prior, the agents will have expectations that differ by at most epsilon. Okay, so let's just say maybe this is enough. Let's try to instantiate this idea in our framework, right? So now say that this model magically and this human are both Bayesian updaters in this way, right? So we'll go back to a scenario where the model says, I think the risk of operation is 0.2. And the human, instead of just being sad, they have something to do now. We're in some protocol. So they can respond and say, well, actually, this is what I think. Even after telling me that information, I think the answer is 0.4. And now seeing that, this model will update its posterior and reply. And the Aronson result tells us that if these were both Bayesian updaters, with high probability within only 1/epsilon² delta rounds, they're going to get within epsilon agreement of each other. Okay, which is kind of nice, right? So like this idea of the agreement part, I think feels valuable and good, because what's happened is now whatever we've ended up with, this is something that the human can actually say at this point, what the model is telling me, the recommendation, is actually something that I agree with as well. So I'm happy to do this thing. It would be even better if this sort of result can also tell us that in going through this procedure, we actually got to a better result than we were at the beginning. We're also going to get something like that in this work. Okay, so here we're happy. Unfortunately, that's
Natalie,
not...
do you mind if I just ask a quick question about
Go ahead, yeah.
So is the setup that the two agents in this case have a common prior?
Great question. So in what I'm kind of describing right now is a bit of a straw man. I'm saying if we'd had that assumption, then this works. And I'm about to say that's not realistic.
Okay.
Great question. Cool. So this is how it would work if there was a common prior and if we did have correctly updating the posterior. But this is a result that assumes perfect Bayesian rationality for both of the agents, right? So there are obvious drawbacks here. So this is intractable, right? The feature space we might be looking at in some of these, for example, medical decisions, is really big and can be arbitrarily correlated with the label. I think it's unrealistic to assume this of a human, right? So, do humans really have a correctly specified prior on the universe and fully, do they really use Bayes' rule every time to update the posterior? We might want to have a strictly weaker assumption on the human behavior. And furthermore, models, I don't even really know what it would mean to say that a model is Bayesian rational, right? But, you could try to implement a model that does all the rules and make it look like it is, but it would be intractable to do so. And furthermore, it's not known whether this result generalizes to multidimensional predictions. And, lots of cases, you might want to consider predicting something that's multidimensional. Okay, so the salient question in this talk is, can we relax the behavioral assumptions while still maintaining good agreement convergence guarantees that will also augment accuracy? And the answer is yes. And the way we do it is with calibration. So does that answer your question, Sanjoy? Okay, wonderful.
Yep, it does. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna now go through an overview of the results. Okay, so we are introducing this new calibration measure called conversation calibration, which is strictly more general than Bayesian rationality, right? So it is satisfied by a human who is actually updating according to Bayes' rule and has a correctly specified prior over the event. And is also efficiently enforceable on any sort of model without accuracy loss, right? So if we're imagining interaction as we're motivated between a human and a model, this is nice for both of them. We can make less behavioral assumptions on the human, and this is something we can efficiently just add on to any model without making it worse. And this notion is sufficient for fast agreement convergence in a repeated setting. And I will talk more in a bit about what I mean by repeated setting. But even if you aren't particularly, oh, and yes, and as long as the conversations go, the longer they go, the more accurate the final predictions are. Okay, and even if you don't care about the repeated setting, even though I think, I'm a strong believer that many of the decisions that we made are made repeatedly, and we should care about this. But we actually are able to recover the Aronson results by having a reduction to the one-shot setting. And because we're using calibration tools, we're actually able to generalize these results to multiple dimensions and action feedback, but in the one shot, not the repeated setting. But only in the case where the agents really are Bayesian, right? So we have this generalization in the repeated setting of the behavior we need to agree. And then in the one-shot setting, we have a recovery of those results and also a couple more results where we're looking at multiple dimensions and action feedback. Before I go on, any questions about the results that I'm going to talk about today? Okay, cool. You always get roughly the length of time it takes me to take a sip. So I will now continue. Okay, I will now talk about what this repeated.
So Natalie, can you repeat once again? What was the
Yes.
one-shot solution, like of Aronson's result?
Oh yeah, sure. Let me just go back. Okay, yeah. So Aronson is looking at it's I can see why it might be confusing to call it one shot because there is a repeated thing happening, but it's a repeated interaction sort of over one single instance of trying to predict something, right? So what's happening is there are two rational Bayesian agents who both have some signal. They both have an agreed upon prior, and then they both get some extra information from that prior. And then they're going to exchange their expectation over the thing they're predicting back and forth, updating their posterior and then sending their new posterior expectation until the thing they're evaluating is within epsilon of each other. And the proof is that with probability 1 minus delta, this will happen within 1 over epsilon squared delta. Rounds. Cool. Okay, so we have rounds. We're now going to introduce days. Okay, here we go. Cool. So what do I mean now by this repeated setting? So every day we have a agent, not an agent, we have a human, a small weak child come in, and they might have some features which are digestible to the human and features that are more digestible to the model. So here I'm denoting this XTH and XTM. And every day we're going to have a conversation over multiple rounds. So here we're distinguishing between days and rounds, right? So days are like different times we're having this agreement protocol happen, but every day you'll have multiple rounds. Okie dokie. So we can imagine again, as we were before, they're going to go back and forth using some behavioral assumptions, which I will define soon, but right now I'm just defining the protocol. And at some point, if here we're saying that we're looking for agreement within, maybe 2%, here we're saying good enough, we agree. And then we move on to the next day. And we have a new patient come in, a new set of features. And again, the agent, the human and the model will engage in conversation in which say, well, this is what I think it is. Well, given that you said that, this is what I think it is. And then at the end of every particular day, they get to see what the true label was. Okay, cool. So that's the protocol. Now, what is conversation calibration? I'm going to start by defining what perfect conversation calibration is. So for those of you who are familiar with calibration, calibration is generally defined by two things. And, I apologize. I actually realized that when I gave this talk last, it was at a calibration workshop. So I did not actually include in here a formal definition of calibration, and I really should have. So let me just try right now just saying in words what it is. What calibration is the standard notion of calibration is if I am predicting something, and then my predictions at any particular time are paired with an outcome, then I'm calibrated if, all the times that I said that the prediction was roughly, 10%, in fact, it was true that the prediction was about 10%. So I kind of am going to, look at the different types of predictions that I made and say, well, all the times I said it was about this, I'm going to look at what it really was. And I should be unbiased kind of on those bucketings of my predictions. In the case of perfect conversation calibration, we're actually going to bucket on the other person's predictions. And so here's how it's going to work. So we're going to look at this whole transcript of play, which includes both days and rounds, right? And we're going to look at any particular round. So this is going to hold true for all rounds, some particular round, right? So like all the predictions that were made at that round, when that, at least only on active rounds, right? Because some days might have agreed before that round. And we're going to look at the bucketing of the other person's predictions on previous days. So I'll say, okay, well, let me think about all the days that the other person predicted something kind of close to 10%. And I'm going to look at my subsequence on round, say, K, what I predicted as a human on round K. Only on days when on round K minus 1, the model predicted close to 10%. I'll look at that subsequence, and I'm saying I'm calibrated on this subsequence. So on this subsequence, when I say 11%, the answer is around 11%. When I say 30%, the answer is around 30%. Okay. Yeah, I apologize that I don't have the formal definition of calibration here, but if anyone has any questions or ways I can clarify this, please feel free to ask. Okay, I'll just go on for now. Okay, wonderful. So just to clarify here, right? So we just showed the subsequence that we have to be calibrated on when the last round they predicted roughly 10%. Now they predicted roughly 50%. You also want to be calibrated on this subsequence. So it should be true for all the subsequences and also for every round. So this is conversation calibration error. Here it is defined formally. And it turns out that just like with normal calibration, you can actually, even in an adversarial setting, you can achieve sublinear conversation calibration. So there's some great tricks, all started by Foster-Vora back in maybe the 80s that give us these lovely results. So it turns out that amazingly, even if I don't actually know anything about the underlying prior, or the distribution, I can still be calibrated. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about why approximate conversation calibration leads to fast agreement. Now, I haven't defined approximate conversation calibration yet. I've just defined perfect conversation calibration. So we're going to start there and talk about why that is useful. And then I'll talk about what approximate conversation calibration is and how it doesn't change the result in a way that makes things bad. So let's start with the first point I want to make, which is just, let's imagine for a second that we actually are perfectly conversation calibrated. Okay. So say we're perfectly conversation calibrated. Both the human and the agent have this property. Okay. So now we can look at the transcript of interaction, right? Remember, we have rounds, we have days. And we can look at a particular round K. So that's, all the days that we didn't agree before we talked K times. So we'll look at all the predictions that I, in this case, say as the model, made at that round. Okay, so there's two cases here. One case is that if we looked at the predictions on the round right after that from the human, we actually agreed most of the time, right? That after that, we mostly stopped. And that's really good, right? If that happens, thumbs up, because our goal is to show fast agreement. Second case is that's not true. If that's not true, it means that on this subsequence, in the next round, we actually have, at least half the time, a substantial difference in the expectation shown by the human over that of the model, right? Because otherwise we would have agreed. right? Like in this, for example, if we imagine this first disagreement we're seeing here, we predicted 0.21 and then they predicted, like 0.2, that wouldn't be a disagreement, right? You have to be further than epsilon away for it to have been a disagreement. Okay, cool. So the idea here is, okay, so now we're in this case. If that was indeed the case, then the squared error of this second subsequence is actually substantially lower. So the way we get to this is through this one really key idea in our work, which is if you take any sequence, and you say that it's calibrated, conditional on some other sequence, right? So my sequence is calibrated, but also if I look at all subsequences defined by these other sequences predictions, then I'm also still calibrated. Then my second sequence has at least as low squared error, right? And this maybe makes sense because if not, then I'm actually not really calibrated on the other sequence. But furthermore, and importantly, if my second sequence is substantially different than the first sequence, then it has substantially lower squared error. So if we have one sequence and then I'm calibrated on that sequence, but I'm doing something different, it must mean I'm doing something different and better. So this is the key. And why is this nice? Well, it means that before when I said, okay, there's a bunch of different cases where actually the sequence after is disagreeing, it means that the total squared error of the sequence is decreasing. And squared error can only go down so much. So now we have this nice potential function we can bound that will show that quickly we have to reach agreement. Okay, cool. So that's the general intuition for how with perfect conversation calibration, we're able to make sure that we can terminate quickly. And the other thing, I can't fully do all the proofs now, but an important thing that also comes out of this proof is that every time we don't agree, right, our squared error is actually decreasing by epsilon squared times delta, right? So while we would like to agree fast, I'm also saying, not all is lost. If we're taking a little while to agree, it's because something's happening, right? Even in an adversarial case, our squared error is actually going down. Okay, so now we're going to talk about approximate conversation calibration. And the idea here is before I was really talking about parameterizing by bucketing the other person's predictions, but now I'm going to say, okay, when I look at my subsequence defined by the bucketing of the other person's predictions, I don't have perfect calibration. I actually have low distance to calibration, which is this nice metric of calibration that basically says I have low L1 distance in my calibration, in my prediction sequence to the closest fully calibrated sequence, the closest perfectly calibrated sequence. Okay, right, so we have two terms. This first one is basically the distance of calibration. The second one is the bucketing I'm doing on the other person's predictions. Okay, so the key here is that unlike perfect conversation calibration, this can actually be achieved efficiently, this one here. And this doesn't change the story by too much. Right, so just sort of showing the definition, we're going to go back to the subsequence and say, okay, I'm not perfectly calibrated, but I do have low distance of calibration. Oh, I should have shown this slide before. Here is the definition of distance of calibration again. Low L1 distance to your best, to your closest perfectly calibrated outcome. Okay, so here's the idea of the connection here. So we know from the first thing.
Any reason to choose L1, like?
Yeah, so this is not, so calibration distance is not a notion that we defined, though it is a relatively new.
Mhm.
The reason to choose L1 is because this is a very nice definition for which we can show that for any Lipschitz, anything that you're trying to define that is Lipschitz, this does just as well as expected calibration error, and you can actually get root T calibration distance, and you can't get that with EC.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. Cool. So it turns out if you were perfectly conversation calibrated, your squared error, obviously, like it would do this trick we talked about. Either you're agreeing a lot or you're decreasing squared error a lot. We're not perfectly calibrated, but we have low distance of calibration. And so squared error is Lipschitz, right? And so if I told you, if I'd done this other thing, I would have low squared error. And now this other thing I'm doing has a small L1 distance to that thing. I also have to have pretty close in squared error to that, right? Okay, cool. So that's sort of the intuition for why we're okay looking at this approximate notion. So putting this together very roughly, the total number of rounds we can disagree, because note the number of times we can have, the number of times we can agree half the time is very low, right? It's like a log term. And in fact, in our true analysis, our tighter analysis, it actually disappears entirely. So like, pretend for now, like that's basically no days, right? So the number of rounds we could disagree is roughly the maximum possible squared error over the decrease in squared error per round whenever less than half of the days terminate. And so this first thing, right, if we're imagining average squared error, like this is 1. And then the second thing turns out to be epsilon squared delta. Okay, so what our theorem is that if the human in the model, and note that I haven't made this explicit, but this trick that we did, you have to compose it. You have to, from the human to the model and then the model to the human, right? You need both of them to have this property in order to get this potential argument to go all the way through. So our theorem is that if the human and the model both have these conversation calibrated properties, then for any epsilon and delta between 0 and 1, on a 1 minus delta fraction of days, they reach epsilon agreement after both k, at most k rounds. And here k is on the order of 1 over epsilon squared delta minus beta of t. And on the subsequence of days that make it to some round I, the squared error at that point is less than the squared error of the base model, the first predictions on the first round of the game, minus something which also scales with epsilon squared delta minus beta t. And importantly, this beta t, right? I haven't gone into full details. It basically captures some of the calibration error terms and the bucketing terms, but we're able to pick values of f and g. We're able to efficiently enforce them for the model and show they're reasonable for the human, such that this term goes to 0, right? So you basically end up with 1 over epsilon squared delta on top, and then a linear improvement in squared error of epsilon squared delta per round that you're still having a conversation. Okay. Yeah, so that's the general upshot of this work. Here I'm just flashing for you this distance of calibration algorithm. Just, you don't have to read it, but I just want you to show that it's really short. It's actually it's in a paper that I'm on with Aaron as well and some other people in our lab, Myrishi and Ishwararam, Aruna Chalasaran. And so it's nice, it's deterministic, so it's quite easy to get distance of calibration. So if I plug in the best we know of, in fact, the best possible distance to calibration algorithm, then what we can end up getting is that this beta t is t to the negative 1/3. Okay. Again, don't expect you to read this, but just showing that conversation calibration is efficiently enforceable, which means I can take some model, which is not necessarily calibrated at all, and I can let it make its predictions on the first round. So we're imagining, some patient comes in and the model sees the patient and, maybe it's a neural network that has a lot of complicated architecture and it spits out a prediction. But then after that prediction, what we're going to do is basically run on all of the different rounds after that, run distance of calibration algorithm on those predictions and the predictions of the human. And in this way, we're able to make sure that it is actually conversation calibrated. And conversation calibration is also satisfied by Bayesian updaters. So I'm not gonna fully prove this to you right now, but the intuition is it turns out that, true Bayesians who actually are correct about the prior and update the posterior, they're basically calibrated in most ways that we can imagine. Okay, so we have some generalizations that we're able to do because now we're not in this complicated Bayesian updating space. We're really thinking about calibration. So we can now think about d dimensions. Again, won't go into the full details, but it's actually pretty easy to get at least a d squared scaling of this result. So if instead of agreeing about just one dimension, I'm agreeing about a vector, and I want to agree with when every dimension is within epsilon, then we can come up with the same argument and say whenever you don't agree, half the time, then Aaron, at least one of the dimensions is going to decrease by epsilon over d. The max squared error is now d. And so we end up with this d squared over epsilon squared delta. Now, in fact, a more careful analysis gives that this is really just d. And we can also talk about action feedback. So we might have really high dimensions, excuse me, but maybe what we really care about is just figuring out predicting a particular thing, right? So maybe the actual the space we're predicting is quite high dimensional, but ultimately we want to know, like what is the best action to take based on that state space, right? So I want to know what is the correct treatment. And if that's what we're trying to predict and agree upon, right? Maybe we could actually totally disagree about what the likelihood are of the complicated different multidimensional state space, but we're okay as long as we agree that the best thing to do is like not operate, right? So in this situation, we're actually able to get a really nice bound, which depends just linearly on epsilon and delta. And it has this complicated term, but this again will go to 0 with large enough t. And here, the information that they're passing back and forth to each other is what action that they think they should take. And now the calibration condition is on the actions. Okay, so just very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, I'm going to talk about how this can actually be reduced back to the one-shot setting. So here what I'm showing is like two people who I'm saying, say that they really are both Bayesian updaters, okay? So now I can imagine running this protocol, this repeated protocol for many, many, many days, right? Like for a bazillion days. Don't worry, it's just a thought experiment. And we have our theorem, which says that if they both have this conversation calibration condition, then they're gonna reach epsilon agreement in at most k rounds, where this k is this small term. Okay. So I've told you they're both Bayesian. So in fact, they are also conversation calibrated because it's a strictly more general term. And so this theorem applies. And I've taken t to be really big, so we can basically ignore this second term here. But they're not just conversation calibrated, right? They're actually Bayesian. So they don't use history, right? So if they're really Bayesian, that means that every round, the true state of nature is sampled from a prior. And they're only going to use information from that prior and the posterior that round to figure out what they're going to do. That means the rounds, right? It shouldn't say rounds here, they should say days. The days are permutation invariant. So I can imagine permuting the days, right? None of them are actually relating to each other anymore. And I can just, then I'll pick the first day. Now the probability that the first round reaches epsilon agreement within k rounds is 1 minus delta. And I can just throw away the rest of the days. So this is the intuition for the reduction. Cool. So I'm just flashing up on screen again the overview of our results. That's the end of what I wanted to talk about. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so if anybody has questions, go ahead and ask. Let me maybe begin with a couple of questions. So the first one is in terms of this 1 over epsilon squared delta rounds, are there settings in which one could hope for quicker agreement? Are there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so certainly like if we are looking at a setting, for example, the setting where we care about only actions, right? We can show that you can get quicker agreement. That just scales with epsilon. I don't think that there's a proof that even in the Aaronson results that this is tight, right? So it's certainly possible that in all settings you can do better than this. I don't know if there's particular settings you have in mind, but that's sort of what's off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay, that's right. Yeah, I was just wondering about lower bounds.
Yeah.
So the other question I had, and I'm sorry if I'm cutting off anybody else right now. It's just that so you were talking about how this notion of conversation calibration generalizes the Bayesian setting.
Mhm.
So are there then relaxations of the Bayesian setting, still probabilistic model, but relaxations where maybe the two parties have priors that differ in in specific types of ways or something that are also captured by conversation calibration?
Interesting. So you're saying, so we have the Bayesian setting, we have conversation calibration. Are you saying, are there other things that
Yeah,
there
just like on the just staying entirely on the probabilistic side, are there sort of tweaks or relaxations of the Bayesian setting that would also sort of fall within your more general kind of framework here?
Yeah, so one thing that probably wouldn't work is something where both of them think that they're Bayesian updaters, but they really have incorrectly specified priors, right? If they have bias, then that's not going to be captured by our model because we are still calibrated. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, thinking about what sorts of things are in between is something I have to think about more. Because I don't really have like a clear idea of like what examples there are there, but it's a good question. I don't know, Aaron, if you have any thoughts and want to jump in here.
It's a good question. I mean, the important thing is that your beliefs are, yeah, as Natalie said, unbiased estimates of the truth. Yeah, now you could have somehow coarser beliefs than you would if you had performed, you know, a Bayesian update. And, you know, if our posteriors aren't, if our priors aren't the same, but are close in some metric and somehow like our posteriors remain close, things would presumably still work out. But I don't know of any, we haven't thought about it, and I don't know of any crisp
It's a very
conditions.
nice question that we'll keep in mind.
Yeah.
Thank you for it.
Okay, thanks. So are there any other questions for Natalie? Okay, well then let's go ahead and thank her once again.
Thank you so much. All right, how do I stop
Thank
share?
you, Natalie.
There we go.
Maybe we can all like have our video on. So I think I see a few people who joined late, so that way they can introduce.
Yeah, I'll
By the
start.
way,
I wasn't here
both.
at the very beginning.
Yeah, right,
Oh,
right.
sorry.
Yes, I saw Michelle, I saw Injan, so I thought, and I think I saw Sangjin. Yeah, by the way, both the talks were great. So thank you, both Chhavi and Natalie. You did a great job. And those like so the students and postdocs who attended and like who are here, it would be great like if you have any feedback for them, send out an email, give them feedbacks. I think it's a great way to practice giving talks and getting feedback. So just take a proactive step, give feedbacks and so on. Okay, anyway, so those who didn't introduce, so Mitchell, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm Mitchell Black. I guess I don't know what we're doing for introductions. I'll just give you my kind of short bio. I'm Mitchell Black. I'm a postdoc here at UCSD, and I'm advised by Sanjay Dasgupta and Yusu Wang, and I work largely on graph neural networks, but generally just graph theory and topology.
Thank you, Mitchell. Injan, you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Yinzhan. I'm a postdoc here at UCSD working with Bana. I focus on fine-grained complexity and algorithms.
Thank you. Megan? Am I pronouncing the name correctly?
Yeah, Mugen. Hi, I'm a third-year PhD student working under Sungjin Im. And I'm, I guess, looking into some fairness with algorithms and also trying to see if we could use LLMs with integer programs.
Okay, interesting. Sangjin?
Hi, so am I showing my picture camera? Okay, good. Hi, I'm Seongjin. I'm at UC Merced. I joined EnCORE like a couple months ago. Yeah, I work on approximation algorithms, online algorithms. I also work on machine learning augmented algorithms and some database theory and supports. I'm moving to Santa Cruz in January. So
Is there anyone else like who haven't introduced? Okay. Okay, so great seeing you all. Like we will continue this. So our plan is to continue these student seminars once every month, where two of you will be giving presentations. And also our plan is like for everyone, especially the postdocs and senior grad students, to assign you with a faculty mentor who is not your postdoc host or PhD advisor. I think that way, like, yeah, it's just great to have more mentors, I guess, and also like they could help you with your job applications and just be your advocate, and you can discuss whatever you want to discuss in your research, academia, career with them. Um, so starting this with Natalie and Chhavi, but I shared a spreadsheet. Please sign up like to give talks. We'll also take recommendations from the faculty. So they will also recommend whom we should invite to give talks. But our plan is to do this again in November. Do you guys have any questions? Another one thing, like this time we did like introduce ourselves. So one thing that we have done at UCSD, like introduce the neighbor. So we have to find out like next time maybe we'll do introduce the neighbor on Zoom. We'll see how like we have to find out some way like who is the neighbor on Zoom. Or any other ideas you have, like it would be so you this is a big group and it would be good like if you guys know each other's work, know it like and this is a platform for you to meet with each other, share like whatever you want to share. Of course you can meet that. So this is once a month, but I hope this gives you a way to introduce yourselves and then you can go ahead and contact each other and discuss research, life, and whatever you want to discuss.
I guess a similar idea is that next time the two speakers can exchange slide decks right before the meeting and give each other's talks.
We actually did do that. You didn't notice? We must have done a really good job.
Okay. Any other ideas? Or any volunteers? I didn't check the spreadsheet, like if you have already volunteered, like. Okay, you can take your time to volunteer, so it's okay. Any other comments or anything? Sanjay, Raghu, you want to say something? Arya, you want to say something?
I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the talks were very good.
Yeah, both the talks are good. I think this way we have more time from each of the students or postdocs to know what they're working on. So this is great.
Yeah.
And
it's slightly diverse audience, so it's not like theory people giving talk to theory and machine learning folks giving talk to machine learning folks.
But it's still
I think I think it's a good way to get feedback from people who are not exactly in your area, because that's what you are going to face in the job market. So I think it's a good practice. Yeah.
So we are doing this by topics, right? So next time it is going to be some other topic than
yeah, so we would like to see like who are willing to volunteer. If not, like obviously we'll take like suggestions from the faculty to come up with yeah. But yeah, so I think I don't know. So Natalie is in which year now? So Chhavi is looking for postdoc. Natalie is third year.
I'm a fourth year. I'm not looking for postdocs right now, but I'm definitely looking in general for opportunities in academia after my PhD. And I'm always excited to chat with people about research and yeah.
So if we get more volunteers, which is a good thing to have, we'll probably prioritize for those who are more senior, like will be in the job market shortly. Okay. Students and postdocs, like, you guys want to say something? No? Okay, then we can all leave and have a it's the start of the week. Have a good rest of the week.